Hello everybody and welcome to the latest LACE webinar that we have for you today. My name is Chris Howard and I'm going to introduce our panelists and speakers in a minute. But just before we get started, I just thought I'd tell you, for those of you that aren't actually on the call already, a little bit about LACE Partners. So I'm not going to go into great detail about LACE because you either know us or you work with us, or if you want to, you can find out more about us on lacepartners.co.uk, where we've also got a lot of tools with regards to the current challenging situation that we all find ourselves in, hence why we're running this webinar, and we're running it from our respective desks all across the country, although I suspect it's more all across London that we're doing that from at the moment. So yeah, so as I said, we're a boutique HR consultancy, a leading HR consultancy, specialists in transformation, change and adoption. I won't go into too much detail. As I said, you can find that one out yourselves, but I'm here, Chris Howard, and I'm going to talk to you quickly about some of the functionality that you've got. For those of you that have used GoTo before and are very familiar, many apologies, but for those of you that haven't, there is a chat functionality. You can use the chat box to ask questions. I'll be monitoring it throughout the session today. We expect the session to last about 30 to 40 minutes, depending on how much Aaron decides to rein in his fellow panelists, and I'll let him do the judge, jury and executioner on that front. But if you want to ask any questions, I'm monitoring them and we will try to get through as many questions as possible. We have built in some time for those questions, so you will be able to, we'll get through as many as we can. If we don't actually manage to get through every single question, what we will do after this particular webinar, which is being recorded and will be available on lacepartners.co.uk/webinars, we will do an FAQs document as well. So there'll be a Word document which will have some of those questions and some of the answers and any links if required as well. We also have a podcast for those of you that may or may not be aware. It's HR on the Offensive is the podcast. It's released usually on a Wednesday, and this week I sat down with Aaron and Cathy to talk specifically about remote working and how that impacts, culture and the culture within a business, given that you've got so many people that are so spread out in terms of their working patterns and you don't have people in centralized offices anymore. So you can find out about that at lacepartners.co.uk/podcast. We've got some future webinars. This is the first of a series of webinars that we'll be doing relating to crisis management and obviously the current COVID-19 situation, but we'll talk about those towards the end. For now, I think what is best to do is to introduce our speakers. So we've got Cathy Acratopulo. Hello, Cathy, how are you doing? This is the bit where I said to her beforehand, everyone go on mute so that we don't get distortion. And then I've chucked you in there without actually telling you to come off mute.
I'm quick off the draw, Chris. Hi, everyone. Hi, Chris. Good to be here.
We've got Aaron Alburey, who's a fellow co-founder and managing director. Hello, Aaron. How are you doing?
Good afternoon, Chris.
And we've got Kevin Green, who is an author and strategic advisor, and he has promised me he will only plug his book 12 times during the course of this particular webinar. So hi, Kevin, how are you doing?
Hi, Chris. Delighted to be here, and you keep plugging that book.
I'm going to hand across to Aaron now, who's going to be the compere for today's session, and then you'll hear from me at the end. So just to reiterate to everybody, this is being recorded, and we will have a version which we'll send out to everybody afterwards as well. So Aaron, over to you, sir.
Right, Chris, thank you very much. And thank you to everybody for attending today. I appreciate in these times, being an HR professional, this is a really busy time for you all. And really do appreciate your time you're giving us today. So thank you for joining. Before we get into the meat of the discussion and you hear from Kevin and Cathy as we step through sort of the 12 plan, as Chris mentioned, this is going to be the first of a series of 3 webinars, and we're going to focus on the initial actions today, and we'll cover the other ones in the future webinars. I did think it was worth maybe just talking a little bit about the context of why we're running the session today. Clearly, as Chris mentioned, we're an HR consultancy. That's what we do. And for the last 6 years, we've managed complex HR programs, and we work across industries. So we've seen through the initial elements of this crisis how different industries are reacting. And we wanted to share some of that back with you. But also, and I think this is quite important, is we are a small business. We're a small business in an industry sector in professional services that's been impacted as well. And we ourselves, we don't have an HR director because of our HR backgrounds, Cathy and I are looking after the HR elements of our business. And so we're living through this ourselves. And combining that with our experience, we put that together into a plan that we're executing. And we felt that that might be something that might be useful to the HR community and to the HR professionals out there. So we wanted to share that today. And that's really the background and the essence of where we've come from. So we really wanted to share that and get that out to yourselves and take you through it. And we've put it around as a 12-step plan. And I'm going to talk you through those elements in a minute. But in essence, what we were looking at is how to answer the three big questions that were facing our business and other businesses. And those three questions being, what actions do you need to take today as an HR director, an HR professional? What actions do you need to take immediately? Clearly, there are some that are more obvious than others, but it's a very changing environment. And as we hear from the Chancellor on an almost daily basis, and from the government on an almost daily basis, our plans, the HR plans, need to flex and change regularly. So what do we need to do now? The second question is that clearly, and depends on who you talk to, this could be anything from 3 months to a year, where we're ending up in some form of remote working or enforced home working. And that is clearly a difficult, stressed position for an organization to be in. And one which, over time, you need to think about the engagement, the well-being, and the health of your teams. And that second question about how to sustain that is where we'll focus the second webinar. And then the third question we really wanted to talk about and answer was, at some point, there will be a return to some form of the old normal. And I suppose all of you will draw your own perspectives on this, but there is quite a strong likelihood that return to normal will be a return to something different from what we started at. There is too much that has changed through this process for things to go back to the way they were 100%. So how do you prepare for that return, and how do you ensure as an HR professional your business is as ready as possible to really thrive as you come out of that, as we come out of this crisis and we move on? So those are the questions we set ourselves as we were looking at our own organization and thinking about it with our HR hats on. That's what we were thinking about when we came up with the 12-step plan. And what we're going to do is to share those 12 actions with you. And they're really just a framework to help you think through, are you asking yourself all the right questions? And you can see now on the screen just those three big question areas: the reactive type of activities, what we're doing now, the supporting ones, and the thriving. And in today's session, we're going to talk about that first row. We're going to talk about those first 4 sets of actions in more detail, reflect on what we're hearing in the market, reflect on what other HR directors are telling us, and what we're seeing and learning. On the second webinar, we'll focus more around that sustaining your workforce through this period of time. And engagement, clearly keeping it creative, thinking about well-being. There's a great article in the Times recently that Cathy shared with me actually around sort of increased challenges with back pain, etc., for people home working and ways to combat that. And then clearly in this period of difficulty, leadership behaviors will be quite key, and how your leaders behave, how well coached they are by you as the HR organization through this time of difficulty will be key. We've deliberately put the activities under 5 and 9 on either side of this as bookends, because unfortunately or fortunately in an HR environment, you're always having to operate in a policy environment, and new policies are coming to the fore all the time right now. As an organization, we were quite connected into remote working. We remote worked a lot as an organization, and our policies were adequate. As we look at what we need now for the new way of working, we've had to enhance a number of those. And then a number of you will be working in sectors that are regulated and compliant. And you need to follow those compliance regulations and guidelines, even during this period. And a lot of those are not keeping up with the pace of change in your organizations. And so you need to think those through. Finally, that third set, which we'll come on to in the third webinar, are around the transitions back into BAU. How do you do it? What parts of your organizations do you re-engage when? How do you bring back the workforce that you may have furloughed? How do you bring them back into the organization? How do you meet the new offerings that your organization may have transformed into as part of the changes that have happened? And the thing I know that Cathy's very passionate about is retaining home working. You know, we're all now working in a very different environment. A number of you will be from organizations where home working may well have been frowned upon as part of the way of working before, where now you are now in a position where everyone is home working, or a vast majority of your staff may well be home working. And there'll be good things that come out of that. There'll be new good practices, not least potentially time with friends and family, a better way of living and balancing work life that you may want to retain in your going forward organization. So think about that, and we'll go on to cover that. So that gives you a feel of the 12 steps. And to say, what we're going to do now is with my two panelists and colleagues, we're going to drop in to talk about the reacting activities and the core focus. I mentioned at the start, we have the benefit of looking across a number of industries and sectors, and we've spoken to a large number of HR directors. Even more so, Kevin gets involved in a lot of those discussions, not least as the ex-CEO of the Recruiters and Employers Confederacy. There's a lot of people you'll be talking to, Kevin, and I'd be interested to understand your perspective on their views and what you're hearing from those HR directors, but also how they feel this compares to some of the recessions of the past.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, thanks, Aaron. I think there's a couple of things that are worth saying. Is that from a macro perspective, I think this feels quite different than previous recessions. If you think about the recession that many of us would have lived through, 2008 through to 2010, there was a debate that went on for about 6 months about whether we were going to go into a recession, and people started to make decisions about investment and hiring, slowing up hiring. What's actually happened here is we've gone into something much more severe and much faster. So just to give you a couple of things, one is the downturn in times of the market. You know, we've lost 35 to 40% of value across the stock markets across the world, and we've done that in 2.5 weeks. It took 3.5 months at the beginning of the recession for us to find, to end up in that place. And in terms of employment, which is the backdrop that I think most of us are working within, if you look at what's happened in the UK and perhaps even more so in North America, but we've had nearly 1 million people register for universal credit in 2 weeks. And it took us 3 years to get 1 million more people unemployed during the 2008-2009 recession. So, I was listening to a podcast with an economist, and he said it's like a meteorite has hit the earth, and it's basically stopped economic activity. So we are going into something which is much more severe and at a faster pace. So what I think that means for HR directors is we're having to, as part of the leadership team within our organizations, make decisions quickly. We're going to have to make them so that they can be deployed immediately. I mean, many organizations that I was talking to in week 1 of this were talking about how do we go to remote working within 4 days. We haven't got the systems. We're buying laptops. We're moving our call centers offline, but we're going to do it at pace. In most organizations, 60 to 70% of the cost base is people. So how do we reduce our cost base to reflect what's going on for us in terms of our customers? And how do we do that in a fair, consistent way? How do we take as many people with us as possible to get from this side of the crisis to the other side of the crisis? So I suppose in sort of summary, I think it's an experience that none of us will have had before. We may have been through recessions and crises, but this one feels quite different, and it's forcing people to make decisions at a much faster pace. So I think that's why we think this 12-point plan is important, and that people have a backdrop in which to question themselves and their business as they're having to make decisions at pace.
Great, thank you, Kevin. I'm going to take us on now, if that's okay, to talk about the first of the areas in the reaction activities, and we're going to focus on these 4. And we're going to look at strategic response. Clearly a lot of you will be engaged as HR directors or HR professionals in your business's response to the crisis, and that can vary. Clearly we're seeing some parts of some industries where in effect their businesses have completely shut down, travel, tourism, entertainment, etc., through to other areas where there is an element of growth or an element at least of increased volume, online retailers, for example. So everyone is having to deal with this in a different way. And I think probably the key thing has been that most people have just ripped up their 3-year plan and are now reconsidering everything across their business. Cathy, if I may just ask you first, in terms of strategic response, what are the kind of things you're hearing?
Yeah, sure, Aaron. I mean, I think the first thing I would say is that certainly the HR directors and professionals I've been speaking to over the last few weeks are under huge pressure. You know, you're part of an executive team, like Kevin said, who are going through something you've never experienced before, and a large chunk of the impacts relate to people. So actually, as an HR director or a professional sitting as a member of a leadership team, actually a lot of that leadership team are looking to you to help them navigate through the crisis. And that's, you know, that's scary in the sense that you haven't got all the answers. It's not something we've experienced before at this pace. And also it's a pressurized environment. So I think first thing to say is, you know, that in itself is just worth acknowledging, I think, in terms of the situation we find ourselves in. And what we're hoping is this 12-point plan gives you at least a structure to help think through how to navigate. But that first one around strategic response, you know, obviously as part of that leadership team, the first thing is how does it impact us? You know, ultimately, cash becomes king. If you're in a business where your products or services are suddenly either you can't produce because you basically are shutting down as a result of the impact, if you're in the hospitality sector, for example, or you're in a situation when you now actually have to try and do what you did before, but remotely. But there are some businesses, obviously, who are in a situation that may be seeing increased demand in the current context. And obviously, you know, some parts of the economy are seeing growth at this time, although they may well be in the minority. So it's that impact analysis, really understanding and being, as an HRD or an HR professional, contributing to that understanding and being able to understand the critical path that you need to make decisions on and in what order. And one of the things that I think we've seen other organisations do, which I think is probably a natural response, is a recognition that actually as a team, as an executive team, you now actually need to spend time together on a really regular basis, at least daily. I know Aaron and I have probably seen far too much of each other over MS Teams over the last few weeks, having exactly those conversations about how does it impact us and how do we navigate. But maybe that sort of crisis management board or some form of additional governance that you as an executive team need to form. And you know, you are a critical part of that. And at the same time, then being able to understand really, you know, from a people point of view, what are your immediate impacts? As I said earlier, cash is king. So from a cost base, as Kevin's pointed out, people are a huge component of that. So depending on the impact on your business, how can you control the cost base that relates to people? How can you interpret the various government policies that, you know, we've heard of for some time? But if we think about things like the job retention scheme, the furloughing, we've really only got official detailed guidance on that last Thursday evening, early Friday morning. So actually the need to be able to interpret new policies, new guidance, new government information quickly and understand how you then apply that in your organisational context is really critical. Kevin, I know you've got lots to say on this topic.
Yeah, I think there's two things that I think are just practical things that I think I've picked up. One is, I think you've got to have an initial critical path. And I think that is, what decisions do we need to take when, and what data do we need to be able to make those decisions? And I think what I've seen with lots of management teams is they've done that initial piece of work, but within 3 or 4 days, it's out of date because things are moving so fast around them. So I think you've got to have a critical path. You've got to decide what decisions you need to make when, but also what data do we need? Do we need more information about the cost base, about rules, about redundancy? So I think you've got to have a plan, and you've also got to recognise that you're going to have to be responsive. So I think that's one. The second one is actually about how decisions are made. Now, again, and I can't use named organisations, but there was a couple of organisations that in the first week, I would have to say that conversations with HR directors and CEOs and MDs were very panicky. People were under pressure to make decisions, but they hadn't really thought through all the consequences. So one of the things I think, certainly at the beginning of this, I think the HR directors played a really important role of slowing people down, creating some calm, and actually saying, can we sleep on this? Can we make the call tomorrow? And I think as soon as you start to look at some of the big decisions, you know, one organisation I know was laying off half its workforce. You know, that's a huge decision with hundreds of thousands of people's lives at stake that you don't want to make in a hurry. You do want to make sure you've got the data. So I think one of the big roles of an HR director is to slow the management team down, make sure they look at the consequences, make sure they've got the data, and they're making as good a decision as they possibly can. So I think there's a big role for the HR director within those that context.
I agree, Kevin, and I think one of the big challenges, and you touched on this with the point about the last recession. Recessions are a well understood beast. There's a path that they go through, and we can understand and have seen in the history how those progress. This is just such an unknown factor for people. The uncertainty of how long it's going to last, the depth of impact. That I think is what I have seen leading those management teams to make those kind of decisions. And I think to your point, there's what's the implication for your employee base, but also what's the potential implication for your brand through this? We're seeing several examples play out across the press of organizations where they have made the wrong snap decision and it's in the limelight. And that is potentially damaging not just their ability to retain staff in the longer term, but also their ability to gain customers and retain customers through this process as well. Do you have any thoughts on any of that?
I mean, I think you're absolutely right around brand reputation. I think there's, you can see some organisations making decisions, and you can see on social media that people say that, hundreds of people saying we won't forget the organisations that treated customers and staff poorly in this situation. And it comes onto one of our points in a moment, but it's about, again, holding the organisation accountable when it's making decisions to its values and its behaviours. And I think the HR director, it plays that role. It holds up the mirror, the values and behaviours that we've stated we're going to live by. We're in a crisis, and we've got to make some decisions, but we do need to make sure we are looking at and revisiting those values and behaviours.
Definitely. And I think that brings us on probably, Cathy, to the second activity here that people clearly move on to. Once you understand the strategic response of your business, the elements you need to keep in that critical path and the way you need to tackle things, clearly you then move on to thinking about the workforce planning and that emergency workforce planning, those initial thoughts around that. Then we're seeing a number of different things play out there, not least understanding the major people risks in some cases for the first time for organizations, where their people risks lie, because it's just so in the limelight and under the magnifying glass. Cathy, any sort of thoughts around the workforce planning side of things?
Yeah, and I think let's be clear, this isn't strategic workforce planning, right? The long-term stuff that we know will come later, and we'll talk about that in later webinars. This is the immediate impact planning. This is the emergency workforce planning. So based on the pretty much overnight change around what's happening to product services, how and where your people can work and your cost base, it's understanding those impacts and making quick decisions, although insight-led decisions, as you said, Kevin, not knee-jerk reactions, but thought through but quick decisions around identifying your critical workforces. So who do we absolutely have to prioritise in terms of ensuring that we can continue to operate and can continue to bring in hopefully a level of income that will see us through the crisis, versus those that actually maybe are less critical in the context of the pandemic, and therefore we need to consider actually how we can potentially reduce cost. So if you think about a services-based organisation, obviously those who are providing the services, making sure that you're dealing with the absenteeism that will come from sickness, from isolation, from caring for others, and balancing that with maybe saying, okay, I need to prioritize to ensure I've got enough people that can continue to deliver the service that I'm here to do, to bring in the revenue that I need to survive over the period, versus looking at maybe you're more in that scenario, your back office working, and saying, actually, how can I reduce costs using maybe the government schemes that have been presented around furloughing, for example, to actually bring my cost base down. So whilst my revenue takes a hit because there's less demand, how can I sustain enough revenue to take me through that and generate the cash that I need with the sufficient workforce that will actually deliver that for me as a business? So it's getting that balance right between continuing to do what you do and provide the services that are relevant during the crisis versus reducing your cost base on the other hand in a manageable way that enables you to balance the people risks that come with that. So I think it's a really difficult balancing act, and one that I think, the pace of change as we're going through the pandemic is so fast that it's something you need to revisit, on a regular basis. That, what you decide today may not be the right decision in a week's time, and it's having that sort of governance in place for the rapid decision making to change the direction of where you're going, that enables you to then be responsive as you go through that.
Yeah, thanks, Cathy. And I think clearly a key role for HR professionals in there in terms of managing that process in a considered way. And I think, Kevin, you touched on this, taking some time to really think through the potential implications on your workforce of these decisions which you need to make at pace. Now, I'm conscious, Kevin, in your past, you held a senior HR role in the Royal Mail at a time when they did a massive amount of restructuring. And how does this compare?
Well, I think it depends on the organisation. I mean, we were losing £1.5 million a day, so the business was on the edge of insolvency, and we had to do things quickly, which means that you've got to make fast decisions, and we've talked a bit about that. You've got to be quite brave and quite courageous. You can't sit on the fence. You haven't got months to make decisions and to weigh them up. There's a great quote from Colin Powell, which is, you don't make decisions if you've only got 40% of the information, but you must make decisions if you've got 70%. So it's actually getting enough information to be able to make the decisions that you need to make. A couple of things that I think I've picked up from HR directors, which have proved quite challenging in this space. One is about this idea of fairness. We're going to pay people to sit at home and get 80% of their salaries, but we want everyone to have a pay cut. But actually, a lot of people are going to be working even harder and longer hours. How do we square that circle? We've also got to make sure that, in a union environment, we're consulting, we're talking to our people, we're asking for ideas, we're asking for people to volunteer to go on sabbaticals or for unpaid or to do things with leave. So there's lots of dynamic questions that I think you have to work through. And one of the ones that I've seen, and we certainly used this model at Royal Mail, was to get a group of people, a cross section of workers, from senior managers through middle managers through frontline staff, that we used as like a sounding board, so that we brought them together, and twice a week we would say, here are some of the decisions we've got to make, give us what you think, give us your response. And again, I think it was a good way of creating sort of a sample where you could get an initial view from your people about what sounded fair, what was consistent with our values, where did they think we were potentially going to go too far, what would they consider to be, off the charts and unacceptable. But you've got to find a way of getting fast feedback. You can't consult, you can't do it in the ways that you would do it normally. So create a sort of a focus group, or a small group of people, and test ideas with them and get them to give your feedback. The other thing I think is important in terms of leadership teams is they spend a bit more time listening to each other. One of the things that you find in a crisis is people get myopic. They focus on the here and now. And I think one of the jobs of the HR person is to make sure that, when you have a leadership conversation, everyone's talking, people aren't going silent, people are giving their views. You may ask people to play devil's advocate and challenge things. You may ask other people to play roles where they're arguing even something they don't believe, so that the thing gets really tested. You really work through consequences of decisions that you're making. You do some scenario planning. And I think there's a lot of work to be done about what the workforce looks like, but then how's the fairest way to do it? And how do we make sure we take as many people with us as possible?
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. And I think that point about the taking a cross-section of your organization and being transparent with them around the challenges, I think is really key. And we're going to come on and talk now about cultural congruence, a phrase I know, Cathy, you're really passionate about. And this point about fairness as well, right? So one of the major elements of all of this change is about living your values. And there are real challenges at times of stress, as we know, and times of challenge, and the moments that matter move on. And you've got to think about what you're going to do around that cultural congruence. And Cathy, what are some of the things you're seeing HR directors struggle with or focus on in this space?
Well, look, as you said, Aaron, it's something I'm really passionate about. I honestly believe that the way in which organisations behave and are behaving right now and over the next few weeks and months through this experience is absolutely critical, because unless organisations and the decisions that they're making and the way they are managing their workforces are congruent with the way they have been espousing their values and their behaviours, unless there is congruence there, unless the two tally up, I think not only do you end up with a sort of disengaged workforce during the change itself, when you actually need people to be, going the extra mile for you in a lot of cases. So you're going to ask more of them and maybe not demonstrate the behaviours that they expect from you as their leader. But at the same time, when we do come out the other side and when we are in a positive position again, actually, I think that's when people will find this experience that they've been through, I think, for some, quite life-changing in terms of what they've learned about themselves, what they've learned about what they want out of their careers, how they want to work. And actually, I think that there could be challenges around ongoing engagement and ongoing retention even of employees. And we've talked about the customer base and the PR side of this, but actually internally, I think it's critical that actually, that in itself could present quite a risk for the organisation. So whilst the short-term decision might feel, the short-term decisions that we're making around how we manage our workforce and bring our cost base down for those organisations that need to, we have to do it in a way that does feel fair, and we have to do it in a way that is in line with our values. And I doubt there are many values out there that would say that you shouldn't be doing it in a transparent way and you shouldn't be involving people and you shouldn't be keeping them up to date. We know what good looks like, right? We know what we need to do in this situation, and it's just trying to ensure that as businesses that we do that. So in terms of, it is about, and we've had a question come through about well-being, for example. It is about ensuring that you are putting the well-being of the workforce first, that you are trying to be human. At the end of the day, you've got to recognise that people are in a situation where, for those who are working from home, they might be doing that with no childcare whatsoever. They might be, in a situation where they can only work at certain times of the day. It's about ensuring they've got the infrastructure they need to operate well around them at home if they are remote working. It's ensuring that people who are on furlough, don't feel distance. Of course they can't work, that's the principle, but they still need to feel engaged in some way. So it's trying to get the balance right and ensure that you've put the interventions in place that actually say, how can we keep our organisational culture alive during this period, and how can we actually really reinforce it by the way we are behaving and the way we are treating our people. So I think there's HRDs, obviously, to me, have a critical role to play in that. Obviously, the leadership teams as a whole are accountable, but it's HRDs and HR teams who have that role to, as Kevin said, hold the mirror up, but at the same time, challenge decision making to ensure that is taken into account, because I don't think we should underestimate the potential financial performance impact on the business longer term, bottom line impact of getting this wrong. So, good examples obviously are about that ongoing engagement, trying to be creative, innovative with how you're working with your teams, coming up with lots of engagement activities to keep people positive, ensuring that people know what's going on and are completely up to date on the decisions you're making, and that you are perceived as being as transparent as possible during the process.
Excellent. Thank you, Cathy. And as I said to everyone, I know Cathy's incredibly passionate around this space. And one of the interesting things I found recently talking to an HR director in this space, because I'd always thought about this and around taking the values forward and your culture forward that you had before the crisis and reinforcing those through the crisis to ensure those stay in place. And clearly that's for a lot of organizations is the case. But I have come across a couple of organizations in recent discussions where they've had to completely pivot their culture, in particular those that were more academic, more consultative, in nature, where decision making took longer, have actually had to pivot their cultures to be more command and control, more top-down driven decision making, just to be able to be agile enough to get through the first few weeks. And clearly, there's not just a point then about cultural congruence. There's also a piece about reinforcing a new culture through the organization as well, and that level of change. So lots of things in this space, I think, for the HR organizations to consider. Before we move on to recovery planning, and I'm conscious we want to leave some time for questions, there's a number of them coming in now. Kevin, is there anything more you'd like to add? And I'll say just quickly, a quick little bit to add on cultural congruence.
Yeah, I think just a couple of things really, and again, quite practical. I think one is, I think the HR director's got to keep a view on the mental well-being of the top team. This team are going to be under huge pressure. They are going to have to make decisions. You've got to hold up. It's a dual role. You've got to hold up the mirror and be quite courageous yourself in terms of making sure the business is aware of its values and its behaviours that it's stated and making decisions using that. But at the same time, we want to care for the people around that table because they're going to be under huge pressure. Shareholders, government, all sorts of people, media, customers that are going to be wanting the organisation to do stuff in a particular way and a particular timescale. So again, I do think there's a bit about making sure when you have your leadership meetings, people check in. I don't know, a scale of 1 to 5, best day of my life, worst day of my life. And if people say a 1, then you or the chief exec need to revisit that and have a one-to-one and find out. Because what you really don't want is to push people over the edge. And you really want to pick people up and be able to give them the support that's required when they're under this level of stress. So I think there's that's worth mentioning. And the second thing I think is about communication to workforce. I think there is a bit about that Cathy said, which is you've got to do this regularly. The people and leaders have got to be visible, but also you need to play back your values. You need to play back to your organization. We've made this decision because it's consistent with our values and this value and that value, so that they can see that you're making decisions with the values, very much at the front of your mind, because I think that reinforces that these are real. You're making decisions based on the stuff that you've articulated to the organization. And the final point, I think, is yours, Aaron, which the whole thing about pivot and moving at pace and changing cultures. I just think that decision making does need to be a little bit more centralized, but at the same time, you need to delegate authority very, very clearly to other managers and leaders to make decisions. So I think the top team, it's about principles. These are our 6 principles. These are the things we want to stick to. We want you to follow, but we're allowing local managers to make some decisions. But you've got to be absolutely explicit about what the principles are and what's being delegated at what time.
Great, thank you, Kevin. In terms of going forward then, let's just move us on, because I am conscious we're getting a lot of questions and it'd be great to have a chance to answer some of these. So I suggest we cover recovery planning relatively quickly, but it is a key part of some of the things to think about. Clearly, I think a lot of those first 3, 1, 2, and 3, people are drawn to quickly, but as an HR director, you've got to keep an eye on the recovery planning. And at this stage, there's so many unknowns. A lot of that clearly is going to be around modeling and understanding the different options that exist. But let's just have a quick look at some of the activities that we're seeing HR directors undertake in that space. And, thinking about now the return to what the old normal might be and planning beyond that feels and can feel, a pipe dream in some regards to where you are right now in some of the challenges you're dealing with. But clearly, as the HR director, you've got to keep talking to the exec around what the potential upturn might mean for your employee base. In terms of the conversations, Kevin, you've been having, how many of your HR directors are starting to get their heads around this very question?
Kevin, I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I think not many. I don't think many HR directors are really starting to think about the end point of this and what happens then. But I do think that one of the things I would suggest to an HR director is to get a little cross-functional team working on that now and feeding into the leadership team, So starting to think about, if they release this, I think they'll do it regionally, and I think they'll do it gradually to try and manage a second wave of infections. So we'll sort of start to know how they're going to release the pressure and what the return to work policy from a macro perspective would look like. But you've got to have your own situation. Do you move people directly back into the organization? Do you bring furloughed people back? Do you do it in a gradual way? So I think there needs to be a plan, which is, if the world sort of moves this way, this is how we will respond with our workforce. And you might need 3 or 4 scenarios that you start working on now, so that when you start getting into the point when you've got to make the decision, you've done a lot of the thinking.
Great, thank you, Kevin. Sorry, Cathy.
I was just going to add to that. I think, yes, it's scenario planning, but I think there's also the acceptance that we sort of touched on earlier, that I don't think we revert to what we were before. I think we accept that actually there's a new normal here, and we should be looking at this as an opportunity as an executive team to say, okay, what have we learned from this, and what can we do differently going forward that maybe means that we can have a more effective operating model going forward. For example, one of the questions we've had coming through there is around operating model. When do we look at it? I think we can start looking at it now in the context of whether we've got time at the moment, and we're still in crisis mode, okay? But actually it's something that you don't want to leave until recovery is on the doorstep. You want to start thinking about, actually, what of this actually is better for us as a business? What can we learn from what we've been doing? What can we do more efficiently? For example, if we've implemented technologies that enable us to work remotely and more effectively, why wouldn't we want to leverage those going forward? And what does that mean for our workforce longer term? So I think recovery planning to me is, yes, let's scenario plan for the different paced, the different paces of how we might recover, but actually take the time to reflect on what we can do differently and how that might make us better as a result.
Yeah,
I agree.
Aaron, I've got 2 companies, real practical examples, just picking up Cathy's point, where they've deployed AI and chatbots really, really quickly, which they had thought that they would be introducing across a 3 to 5 year period, but they've actually done it within 2 weeks. The issue they have is that may well mean that they're going to automate and destroy a lot of jobs. Now, the question then is clearly an HR one, which is, what do we do with our workforce when we bring back? Do we retrain? How many? So again, I think Cathy's point is incredibly well made. There are opportunities to change operating models. You need to be doing that work now and thinking it through, so that you've got a chance of retraining people. Because what you don't want to do is, having taken your people through this whole difficult period, is then to do a mass redundancy program at the end of it. So I think you've got to think about, how do we do this in a way which enables us to, again, deploy and keep deploying the technology which makes us more efficient and more effective, but also recognizing we've got to treat the workforce well.
Yeah, no, I agree, Kevin. I thank you for that. And I've heard it say that, we've entered a period of social revolution as a result of the enforcement around this, and it's going to be with us for a long time on the back end. And I think that's very much the case. I know we had a question around not only the target operating model, which came up, and Cathy, I think you addressed that. Now is the time to look at operating models, definitely, and not to try and give yourself some capacity to do that in HR. But I think also the question around continuity planning and business continuity planning, I think HR have a critical role to play in this right now. It's one of the other questions that came up, and that's both in the emergency workforce planning, where you're looking at critical workforces and personas and impacted employee groups, but also looking at that recovery planning and thinking about your continuity and how you're going to keep people resilient. Because at the end of the day, as we know, in a lot of organizations, there are small numbers of people in your workforce that end up being the critical pivot points for your organization, and they will be under significant pressure throughout this. And in recovery, you're going to want them to step up again. And how do you manage to make that more manageable is going to be a question that HR is going to have to step in and help with before you burn out some of your critical talent. Thank you very much, everyone, for that. And thank you, Cathy and Kevin, for your input. I really appreciate it. Hopefully that's given some people some practical thoughts and value. We are going to cover the other 2 sections in the next webinars. Chris has been monitoring the questions. There's some great questions coming through. So we want to just take some time now and just get into those questions. And I'm going to ask Chris to ask the 3 of us those questions, and just we'll give you the best answers we can based on the experience we've had so far.
Okay, so thanks to Chris and Kelly for asking those questions, which Cathy and Aaron have weaved into the actual conversation itself. So that was very, very useful. This is a question from Mark. What lessons are we learning about converting a business to a virtual organization? And what are the short and long-term consequences likely to be? Who wants to be first up to take a swing at this?
I think that kind of builds on your point, Kevin. Did you want to just flesh that out a bit more?
I mean, I think, well, the first thing is you've got to be working long-term and short-term at the same time. So you can't put off the long-term questions while you're going through the crisis. So you need to be able to respond to the here and now and help the business get through to the other side. But it's going to throw up opportunities and challenges from a workforce perspective that you need to be working on. My view is that the HR community with some operators need to be working those solutions up now, but you need to create the space for those people to do that. So you need to separate it and create a little project team to do that so that they can bring ideas and solutions back when people are ready to make decisions. So I think that's one thing. The second thing is clearly, how do I best put this? I think the HR community are going to have to make, ongoing tough calls, and I think the point is you have to prepare your workforce for that, and you're not just we've got to be honest and transparent about some of the difficulties that are going to come down the line as well, so that you're preparing people for when those decisions need to be taken. Now they might be 2 months, 3 months away, but I do think you do need to prepare your organization. That's what I meant about visible leadership, honesty, short talking, short presentations from leaders with lots of space to answer questions and to listen to where people are and what's going on.
I think, Kevin, just to add on to that, I mean, from my point of view, just on a purely practical note, for those organisations that aren't maybe in a product environment, where you actually need to physically be somewhere to do what you're doing, for those who can homework, but maybe have been in organisations where it's not really been encouraged or it's not been part of the norm, I think actually in that scenario, unless organisations are willing to build homeworking back into the new normal when we come back out of this, if we try and revert back to the way it was, I think they're actually going to find quite a lot of resistance, because whilst we're probably all being driven stir crazy by being in our houses staring at the same walls for however many weeks already and going forward, I actually think that when we come back to work, and if we are then going back to the office environment that we were in, we're going to miss some of the flexibility that we had from this environment, and we'll always look back probably with rose-tinted spectacles maybe about what we liked about it. But by asking the workforce what they really found valuable about it and which elements of it they would like to continue, I think that's a really important thing to do, to be able to just say, well, what if this worked for you? Why would that help you do your job better when we come out of this, and not throw the baby out with the bathwater and go straight back to what we used to do before. So I know that's sort of quite practical, but I think it's really important.
Yeah. But also, workers have the right to request flexible work, and having worked this way for 3 or 4 months, quite difficult for an organisation to say, "Oh, that'll never work for us. We can't have people flexible hours and managing on output. That'll never work." It's not, So again, there's going to be a challenge for the HR function of dealing with these requests when the evidence is quite clearly there.
Yeah. Excellent. Chris, we had some more questions, I believe.
Yeah, well, this one's sort of linked, so I think it's a segue, I guess. So Rachel's asked her, what are short versus long-term decisions organisations are making with regard to benefit policy changes? And she cites flexible choices, pension contributions, PMI, life benefits versus long-term approach.
It's a good question, Rachel. Thank you. I can talk a little bit about sort of some of the things that we've considered, right? So clearly there are some benefits that when you look at your total benefits package just aren't applicable right now, right? Gym membership, for example, where you've got to look at that benefit package as a whole and say, what are the things that we can't do right now? And then there are some things that you're going to ramp up, and we're going to talk about well-being in the next webinar. Kevin, you touched on it a little bit earlier around well-being. There's well-being of leadership, well-being of employees. And I'm seeing clients look at their well-being offerings in a completely different way now and looking to expand their benefit practices around this space, to expand out the opportunities to keep the mental well-being of their employees stronger through this period and process. So from those perspectives, I think there's definitely changes going on around benefits and the focus points. I think from a reward perspective, from at least what I've seen, that element around benefits has been changing depending on the sector that people are in, and depending on whether or not their organization is doing weathering the storm better than others. Clearly, if your organization is having financial difficulties as a result of lost revenue, people are starting to think about holidays around some of those benefits. Or at least that's what I've seen. I don't know about Kevin, yourself, or Cathy.
I'll be really quick. I just think people want to vary what they have at different times, and I think that what we're going to see is a much more demand driven. So basically there's a value of the benefits package, and individuals can pick what's relevant to them at a certain time. And I think that's one of the things where organizations are starting to treat their employees in an adult to adult relationship. That's the benefit package. These are the options. You choose what's right for you. I think there's going to be a more, much greater drive to that sort of choice.
And I think, just to add to those points, I echo Aaron's point about the focus on well-being. I think that organisations going forward, if they don't have an employee assistance type programme, then I think it's something that maybe organisations will be looking to put in place, so that there is some form of support from a mental well-being point of view. I think an immediate impact, certainly one that we're considering at LACE as well, is what to do about holiday right now. Clearly, people can't take leave. There's the statutory guidance around the carryover period, but actually, how do you ensure that we all had, for example, we've got the Easter weekend coming up, right? 4 days of bank holiday. Normally everyone looks forward to it. I suspect there's some people out there that aren't particularly looking forward to it because it's 4 more days looking at the same walls. It's that sort of, how do you ensure that people feel that they can take breaks when they come back, and that they can take holiday, but actually, if everyone took the holiday that they're entitled to in the period that we've got left, whenever we come out of this sort of pandemic, in a business that relies on their workforce, then they're going to find their productivity dropping. So yes, carryover, but also how can you in some way help employees feel that you're doing what you can for them to reflect the fact they've had a tough time, they've not had the breaks that they would normally have. There's lots of thinking to be done, I think, just in the very short term around that sort of aspect.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I've got another question. This is from Sarita. She's asking about the charity sector, but I think it's this probably applies to our business in general, actually. So what she asks is she's interested in finding out about it's a working from home question. She said interested to find out what other companies are doing in terms of how they handle it, especially working from home. It's new to their sector. I'm sure it's new to a lot of sectors, actually, to be honest with you. How can we as HR teams come up with quick working from home policies, but also provide necessary support to the staff, and she's cited helpline or devices or things like that?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and we're an organisation, like I mentioned right at the start, who have been home working for pretty much the whole of our formation as a business, and we had some policies in place around home working, but what I think lacked is the real guidelines, the practical guidelines, and I think there's 2 things that need to come together when you're thinking about how to address this. One is, what are the practical policies that you need to have in place to manage people through home working, but also what are the guidelines you as an organisation want to give people on how you actually want them to operate? And our internal engagement lead and CSR team in particular have been very active through this process of thinking about the way to keep engagement, to keep people active, to keep people informed on good practice of how to maximize well-being, health, etc. through their ways of working. So I think it needs to be a combination of the 2. There's a lot of information now readily available on open source, CIPD, etc. for HR professionals to get a good kickstart on a lot of this. But at least that's my experience anyway. It needs to be the combination of those 2 things.
I think that the one thing I would say is we don't need long policy documents. Managers and workforce need some very clear principles about how you'd like it to happen. And the one thing that I've found is the organizations that have been best at deploying remote working at pace are the ones that trust their employees. that say, look, we're going to have a team meeting once a day. We're going to give you some regular information, but we're going to let you do your job. Be very clear about the expectations. The one thing I would say to managers, make sure there's more one-to-ones, that you're picking up and touching people on a more regular basis than normal. And 3, don't make this a big turgid policy document that I often see come out of HR.
Yeah.
You know, principles, 1 page of A4. This is how we would like you to operate, manager, worker, within a flexible workplace. And there's lots of good quality documentation and stuff around, as Aaron's already mentioned. CIP have done some stuff. There's a couple of good articles out there as well that I've seen on LinkedIn in the last week or so.
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting when we talk about well-being, and I know we're getting close on time, Chris, so you'll be wanting to wrap this up for us in a minute. But one of the things that someone mentioned to me just this morning in a conversation with an HR director was the fact that I think as a profession, we're all probably cobbler's children when it comes to looking after ourselves in the HR profession, and HR directors in particular. You're in the front line right now, managing your businesses, guiding your employees, guiding your exec. You know, and I think one of the things that I would leave this conversation with is a thought about just your own well-being and the well-being of your senior HR team in the front line of this right now, because you're going to be going through this for quite some period of time. It's not a sprint. It might feel like a sprint right now, but this is going to continue for quite some time, all the way through recovery. And taking some time out as the HR director to make sure your team are coached, you get your own sounding boards and coaches to help you is, I think, another key aspect of this.
Okay, I'm going to try and squeeze one more question in there before we wrap up. And it's again from Rachel. She says, are organisations making different choices for LTIP allocation? And she's talking, of course, about the exec pay decisions versus the rest of the workforce, base pay and bonus. Who wants to handle that? KG sounds like he wants to handle it.
I'll go first. I would just say that I think Cathy and Aaron said it right at the beginning. You know, decisions you make now are going to reflect on the organisation. And I think there's been a few examples of leaders asking their people to do stuff that they're not doing themselves. And I just think that's unacceptable. I think it will create huge amounts of issues and tensions within organisations. You know, if you're asking people to take a pay cut, then the leaders must take the same pay cut, if not more, because proportionately they're going to be earning that much more. And there's one football club, which I know Chris would love me to talk about, which are making some terrible decisions.
Dirty Tottenham.
But I wouldn't possibly mention it. But again, I think it's, you know, you have to role model this stuff. If we're leaders, then we can't ask our people to do stuff that we're not prepared to do ourselves. So you've got to make sure that the exec team is, you know, following through and doing what it should be doing if it's asking people to make sacrifices.
But I think that's also in the context, Kevin, of business performance. You know, there are some businesses that are doing well, right? And so you know, and some businesses that'll see this through and actually come out stronger. So I think it's business context, absolutely, tying it back to business performance. But I completely echo Kevin's point about this is that cultural congruence piece and doing what, you know, asking others to do what you do rather than expecting there to be a disparity.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you very, very much to the three of you. Thank you, Aaron, for comparing. Thank you, Cathy and Kevin, for providing your input. I just asked Aaron to pull up on the screens a little bit of an update. And Abby, I know, has asked this question on the chat box. So I'm getting around to your question now, Abby. The next webinar that we're going to look to run will be next Wednesday. It'll be at 2 o'clock, similar sort of format. We'll get the guys on talking about the second layer, if you like, that Aaron mentioned in the 12-point plan. And then we'll finish off on the 21st of April, just after everyone's got back from Easter, and we'll talk a little bit around the final layer. So we've got some other plans and we've got some other webinars that we'll be doing around operational workforce planning and restructuring at pace. Again, we'll get to those in the coming weeks. And our intention here is to provide these support tools for everybody to be able to feel like, you know, you're not alone. There are a lot of organizations that are feeling stress at the moment, but as an organization, we are trying to help businesses and support businesses with a host of tools, as I mentioned at the beginning, joining. We have a podcast. We'll be doing some podcasts over the next few weeks, released every Wednesday. So you can search for those on iTunes. You can ask Alexa if you've got an Alexa device. We will have this presentation and the slides and the FAQs that will also be available on demand from tomorrow as well. So that leaves me with nothing else other than to say thank you very, very much for everyone for joining. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Cathy, and thank you, Kevin.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much.
Cheers, guys.